I want you to imagine waking up on a quiet Tuesday morning, pouring your coffee, looking out your kitchen window like you have for the last 11 years, and seeing a bulldozer parked in the middle of your backfield. Not near it. Not close to it. In it. That's exactly what happened to me, and by the time this story ends, you'll understand why I still keep a folder of paperwork by my front door, just in case anyone ever tries something like this again. My name doesn't matter for this story, so I'll just call myself what my neighbors eventually started calling me, the guy who blocked the road. I bought 18 acres of land out past the edge of town almost 12 years ago. It wasn't much to look at when I got it. Overgrown grass, a rusted-out fence, an old barn that leaned a little too far to the left. But it was mine. Every inch of it, deeded, surveyed, and paid for. I spent years turning that mess into something I was proud of. A house I built with my own hands, a small orchard, a pond I dug out myself over 2 brutal summers, and a long gravel drive that wound through the property like a private little secret. I tell you all this not to brag, but because you need to understand what that land meant to me before I tell you what they tried to do to it. About 3 years ago, a development company bought the parcel next to mine. Big open stretch of land, maybe 40 acres, previously owned by an elderly farmer who'd finally decided to retire and sell. The company's name was something forgettable, one of those generic titles that sounds like it was picked by a committee, Horizon Ridge Developments, or something close to that. They announced plans to build a new subdivision. Rows of houses, a little strip of shops, the whole modern suburban package dropped into what used to be farmland. I didn't have a problem with that. Truly, I didn't. People need houses, developers need land, and it wasn't my property they were building on. What I did have a problem with was what happened next. See, the land they bought had a strange shape. It was landlocked on 3 sides by other properties, and the easiest, cheapest, way to get construction equipment and eventually residents in and out was to cut directly through the back corner of my land, right where my gravel drive already existed. Instead of negotiating an easement, instead of even sending so much as a letter, they simply started using it. At first, it was subtle. I noticed tire tracks that weren't mine cutting across the edge of my backfield. I figured maybe a surveyor had wandered off course, so I didn't think much of it. Then the tracks got wider, deeper, more frequent. Then, one morning, I found a section of my back fence, the one separating my property from theirs, completely gone. Not knocked down. Removed. Cleanly, deliberately, like someone had come in with tools and taken it apart. That's when I called the number on the construction sign that had gone up near the entrance to their site. A pleasant-sounding woman answered, said she was the project coordinator, and when I explained what happened, she told me, and I remember this almost word for word, "Oh, that's just our access route for construction vehicles. It's temporary. It shouldn't be an issue." I asked her, as calmly as I could, temporary access to my private property that I never agreed to. She paused, then said she'd have someone from the company reach out. Nobody did. A week passed. The tracks turned into an actual worn path. Then that path turned into an actual graded road, gravel, compacted, with small orange stakes marking where they planned to widen it further. They weren't asking for access anymore. They were building infrastructure through the middle of my property like it already belonged to them. I walked that new road myself one evening, just to see how far it went. It cut nearly 200 feet across the back corner of my land, curving right past the edge of my pond, close enough that I could see fresh tire ruts pressed into the soft ground near the water. There were flags marking a drainage culvert they apparently intended to install, right through what used to be a quiet stretch of grass where I'd planned, eventually, to put in a small dock. Seeing those flags, seeing how casually someone had walked my property with a clipboard and decided what belonged where, was the moment this stopped feeling like an inconvenience and started feeling like an invasion. I went home that night and pulled out the old accordion folder where I kept every piece of paperwork related to the property. The original deed, the title insurance policy, the survey from when I first purchased the land, even old photographs I'd taken over the years documenting the fence line and the boundary markers. I spread it all out across my kitchen table and went through it piece by piece, just to be absolutely certain of what I already believed to be true. Nowhere, in any document, was there so much as a mention of a right-of-way, an easement, or any kind of shared access agreement with the neighboring parcel. The land was entirely, unambiguously mine, front to back, corner to corner. I want to pause here and say something important, because I know some of you watching this have dealt with something similar, whether it's a neighbor, a company, or even a local government deciding your land is just an inconvenience standing in the way of their plans. It is astonishing how quickly people assume that if they act confident enough and move fast enough, nobody will stop to check whether they actually have the right to do what they're doing. That was the mistake this company made with me. I drove into town, sat down with a local land use attorney I'd met years earlier through a mutual friend, and I laid my deed, my property survey, and every document I had on his desk. He looked through it for maybe 10 minutes before he looked up at me and said, "They have no legal right to be on this land. None. No easement was ever filed, no agreement was ever signed, and there's no historical right of way here either. This isn't a grey area. This is trespassing, plain and simple." That confirmation was exactly what I needed. Not because I doubted myself, but because I wanted to walk into whatever came next with absolute certainty. I wasn't the unreasonable neighbor causing problems for a company trying to build homes. I was a property owner defending land that was legally, unquestionably mine. So I made a decision. If they weren't going to ask permission, I wasn't going to keep waiting for them to notice their mistake. I was going to block that road myself. I know how that sounds. Maybe a little dramatic. Maybe like something out of an old western. But I didn't do anything reckless or dangerous. I didn't threaten anyone. I didn't damage their equipment. I simply reclaimed what was mine, using every legal tool available to me. The first thing I did was have a professional surveyor come out and remark my property boundary with fresh stakes and flags, undeniable and impossible to argue with. Every stake was accompanied by a printed notice stating clearly that the land beyond that point was private property, no trespassing, and that unauthorized use of the road would result in legal action. Then I had a heavy steel gate installed directly across the graded road they'd built, right at the boundary line, bolted into concrete footings so it couldn't just be knocked over by a truck. I added a chain and a lock rated for outdoor security use, and beside it, a large, clearly visible sign, private property. No trespassing. Unauthorized access will result in legal action and towing at owner's expense. I also installed 2 weatherproof security cameras, one aimed directly at the gate and another positioned to capture a wider view of the graded road itself. My attorney had suggested this before I even asked. He told me that if this situation ended up in a courtroom, time-stamped video evidence would be worth more than any argument either of us could make. It felt strange, standing in my own field, setting up cameras to protect myself from a company that hadn't even had the decency to introduce themselves before tearing down my fence. But it felt necessary, and looking back, it turned out to be one of the smartest decisions I made through the entire ordeal. I remember standing there after the gate was finished, looking down that road they had built through my land, now sealed off completely, and feeling something I can only describe as quiet satisfaction. Not anger. Not triumph, exactly. Just the simple, solid feeling of having done the right thing to protect something that was mine. It didn't take long for them to notice. 3 days after the gate went up, a truck from the construction site pulled up to it and just sat there, engine idling, like the driver expected the gate to open itself. Eventually he got out, walked up, examined the lock, then got back in his truck and left. I imagine he called it in immediately, because less than an hour later, my phone rang. It was a different voice this time, a man, introducing himself as the site supervisor, sounding significantly less pleasant than the woman I'd spoken to before. "You need to open that gate," he told me, without so much as a hello. "You're blocking our only access route to the site." "That access route," I said, "runs through my private property. You never asked permission, you never filed an easement, and you removed a section of my fence without my knowledge. So no, I don't need to open anything." He tried a different approach after that, one I imagine he thought would work better. "Look, we've already invested a lot of money assuming that route was usable. If you don't open it, this is going to cost us a lot of time and money, and honestly, it's going to cost you too, because we'll have no choice but to take this to court." I told him that sounded like an excellent idea, and that my attorney would be more than happy to meet them there. Then I hung up. Now, I want to be honest with you, because this story isn't about me being some fearless hero who never doubted himself. That night, after that phone call, I did feel a flicker of worry. Companies like that have lawyers on staff. They have resources. I was one guy with 18 acres and a folder of paperwork. But worry isn't the same as being wrong, and I reminded myself of something my attorney had told me earlier that week. The law doesn't care how big the company is. It cares whether you have the right to be somewhere, and I did, and they didn't. Word of what happened spread through the area faster than I expected. A few of my neighbors, people who had lived out here even longer than I had, started stopping by just to see the gate for themselves. One older gentleman down the road, who'd farmed his land for nearly 40 years, laughed when he saw the sign and told me he'd had a similar situation decades earlier with a utility company that tried to run a line across his property without permission. Nobody ever expects the quiet guy to fight back, he told me. That's usually exactly why they try it with people like us first. Another neighbor mentioned that she'd noticed survey stakes near the edge of her own property a few weeks earlier and, after hearing what happened to me, called the development company directly to ask what they were for. It turned out they'd been eyeing a small strip of her land too, for a potential drainage easement, and had never bothered to ask her either. Whether that was a coincidence or simply how this company operated, I couldn't say for certain, but it didn't exactly inspire confidence in their intentions. Over the following week, things escalated in ways I honestly didn't expect. First, there were the phone calls, multiple a day, from different people at the company, some polite, some not, all essentially asking the same thing: open the gate. Then there was a letter, hand-delivered, on official company letterhead, claiming that my gate was obstructing critical infrastructure development and demanding I remove it within 72 hours or face further action. I forwarded that letter directly to my attorney, who laughed when he read it and said, "This is empty. There's no infrastructure agreement here. They're bluffing, hoping you don't know any better." He drafted a response on my behalf, calmly and professionally laying out the facts. No easement existed, no right-of-way had ever been granted, the fence removal constituted property damage and trespassing, and any continued attempt to access or alter my land without consent would result in a formal complaint and pursuit of damages. Interestingly, buried near the end of that same letter was a line claiming the company believed they may have already established a prescriptive easement through continued, open use of the route. My attorney explained that this is a legal concept where, in certain circumstances, someone can gain a right to use another person's land if they've used it openly and continuously for a long enough period, usually many years, without the owner objecting. It was almost laughable in this case, since the continuous use they were referring to had lasted less than 3 weeks, and I had objected immediately, in writing, on the phone, and eventually with a locked gate. Still, it told me something important. This wasn't a genuine misunderstanding on their part. Someone in their legal department already knew they were on shaky ground and was trying to build a justification after the fact. That letter went out on a Thursday. By Monday, someone new called me. This time, someone claiming to be a regional manager, someone clearly higher up the chain than anyone I'd spoken with before. His tone was different too. Less demanding, more careful, like someone who had actually read the letter my attorney sent and understood exactly how much trouble they were in. "We'd like to sit down and discuss this," he said. "I think there's been a miscommunication on our end." A miscommunication. That was the word he chose for tearing out my fence and building a road across my land without so much as a phone call. Still, I agreed to meet, because I wanted this resolved properly, not just one on a technicality. I invited my attorney to join, and we sat down at a small conference room in town. Me on one side of the table, the regional manager and one of the company's in-house legal representatives on the other. The meeting started with the regional manager attempting to frame the whole situation as an honest mistake. Apparently, an earlier planning document had mistakenly marked my land as part of an assumed access corridor, something that should have been verified before any construction crew ever set foot near my fence line. Whether that was true or just a convenient excuse, I honestly don't know, and at that point, I didn't particularly care. "Here's what I know," I told them. "My fence was removed without my knowledge. A road was built on my land without my consent. I received no notice, no offer, no agreement, nothing, until I called you myself. So whatever assumption your planning department made, it doesn't change what actually happened." The in-house lawyer, to her credit, didn't try to argue that point. She simply asked what it would take to resolve things. This is where I want to slow down for a second, because I think it's an important lesson buried in this story. I could have used that moment to be petty. I could have demanded an enormous settlement, dragged the situation out for months, made their lives as difficult as they had made mine. But that's not who I wanted to be, and honestly, it's not what I actually needed. What I needed was for my property to be respected, my fence to be properly restored, and fair compensation for the trespassing and the damage that had already occurred. So that's exactly what I asked for. We negotiated for about 2 hours. In the end, the company agreed to fully restore my fence line to its original condition. Actually, they upgraded it, since the new fencing was sturdier than what they'd torn out. They agreed to properly regrade and reseed the section of my backfield that had been damaged by their equipment, including the area near my pond where the drainage culvert had been planned. They paid a fair settlement for the trespassing and unauthorized use of my land. And, if they ever wanted to use any portion of my property for access in the future, they would need to formally negotiate and pay for a legal easement, in writing, signed by me, with terms I approved. I also insisted on one more thing before signing anything, and it turned out to be the condition they resisted the most. I wanted written confirmation, distributed internally within their company, that no further planning documents would list any portion of my property as part of an assumed corridor or any similar designation without my direct, written consent first. It seemed like a small, almost bureaucratic request, but I wanted to make sure this couldn't happen again in 2 years when someone new took over the project and pulled up an outdated map. After some back and forth, they agreed to that too. The restoration work began about 2 weeks later. I watched from my porch as a crew, different from the one that had originally cut through my land, carefully removed the gravel road, hauled it away, and reseeded the area with proper native grass. They rebuilt the fence exactly where the surveyor stakes indicated, using thicker posts and galvanized wire that has held up beautifully in the years since. It was strange, watching them undo in a few days what had taken them weeks to build, but there was a certain justice in it too. The land slowly returned to what it had been before any of this started, patient and unbothered, the way land tends to be. They never approached me again after that. Whatever access issues they had for their subdivision, they solved without touching an inch of my land. Eventually, I heard through a neighbor that they found a way to build their own access road entirely on land they actually owned. Funny how quickly a critical, unavoidable route becomes entirely avoidable once someone stands their ground. I kept that gate up, by the way. Long after the settlement was finalized, long after the subdivision was built and families moved in next door. Not out of spite, but because it reminded me of something important. Property lines aren't just abstract legal concepts. They represent years of work, of sacrifice, of building something from nothing. When someone treats that boundary as an inconvenience rather than a right, it's worth standing firm, even when it feels uncomfortable, even when the other side has more resources than you do. Looking back now, a few years removed from all of it, what strikes me most isn't the anger I felt in the moment, or even the satisfaction of winning. It's how avoidable the entire situation was. All it would have taken was one phone call before they ever set foot on my land. One conversation. One offer to negotiate an easement like reasonable people. Instead, they assumed silence meant permission, and they learned the hard way that it didn't. The subdivision eventually got built, just as planned, though it took a little longer than the company probably wanted, thanks in part to having to reroute their entire access plan. A couple of years later, new families moved into the houses along the street closest to my property line. Funny enough, a few of them have turned out to be genuinely good neighbors. One family even asked me, quite politely, whether I'd consider selling a small strip of land near the road for a proper, legally documented shared driveway easement, since it would make both our lives a little easier. I said I'd think about it, and eventually we worked out a fair arrangement together, drawn up by an attorney, signed by both parties, recorded with the county. It took maybe 2 weeks from first conversation to signed agreement. No bulldozers, no torn down fences, no lawyers threatening each other over the phone. Just two reasonable people having a conversation and putting it in writing. It's almost funny how simple it can be when you actually ask first. If there's one thing I hope you take from this story, it's this: know your boundaries, quite literally. Get your property properly surveyed. Keep your paperwork organized and accessible. And if you ever find someone, whether it's a company, a neighbor, or anyone else, using your land without your permission, don't assume you have to just accept it because they seem bigger, more official, or more confident than you. Confidence isn't the same as being right. I wasn't the one who was wrong in this story, and I never doubted that for a second, even when they tried very hard to convince me otherwise. That gravel road still sits there today, right up to my property line, then stopping cold at a steel gate with a sign that hasn't needed to be replaced in years. Every so often, when I walk out to check on the fence line, I glance at that gate and remember exactly why it's there. Not as a monument to a fight I had with a development company, but as a quiet reminder that some lines are worth defending, no matter who's standing on the other side of them. And if you ever find yourself in a similar situation, someone treating your property like it's theirs to use without asking, don't be afraid to do exactly what I did. Document everything. Talk to a professional who actually knows property law. And if it comes down to it, don't hesitate to put up your own gate, literally or figuratively, and make it clear that your land isn't up for negotiation just because someone else finds it convenient. Because at the end of the day, a deed with your name on it means something. It's not just a piece of paper sitting in a drawer somewhere. It's proof of a boundary that deserves respect, and if anyone forgets that, sometimes the only way to remind them is to make that boundary impossible to ignore. That's the whole story. A road that was never supposed to be there, a fence that was never supposed to come down, and a gate that made sure neither mistake happened again. If you've ever dealt with something like this yourself, a neighbor, a company, anyone assuming your property was theirs to use, I'd genuinely like to hear how you handled it. Sometimes the best lessons in situations like these come not from the people who write about them, but from everyone else who's lived through something just as frustrating and came out the other side standing their ground. Thanks for reading this story all the way through. If it resonated with you, or if it reminded you of your own experience protecting something that mattered to you, consider sharing it with someone who might need to hear it. You never know who might be standing at the edge of their own property right now, wondering if they have the right to say no. They do. And sometimes, all it takes is a gate, a little paperwork, and the willingness to stand firm to prove it.